From its inception, Israel was hated by its Arab neighbors, who refused to even recognize it as a country. This was due to the fact that they saw Israel's land as stolen Arab land, as there was a large number of Arabs originally living there. This would create hostile relations with Israel's Arab neighbors, which would eventually lead to war. The Arab countries expected Israel to be a pushover, believing the newly formed country couldn't possibly stand to their power. 2 major wars later, Israel had not only held them off, but managed to become a major power in the region. During the second major war, the Six-Day War, Israel managed to grab the Golan Heights from Syria as well as the entire Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. It also managed to wipe Palestine off the map, gaining all of its land. With this newly found power, Israel would demand to be recognized by the Arab nations. They would not only refuse, but themselves demand the withdrawal of Israeli troops from its newly conquered territories. Israel would refuse, of course, and their newfound power would result in the preservation of an uneasy peace in the region. In late 1970, around 3 years later, the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser died. He would be succeeded by Anwar Sadat, who would come to see what a demoralizing effect the loss of the Six-Day War had on the Egyptians. Even so, he would attempt to resolve the whole thing peacefully. However, Israel was skeptical about Egypt's intentions, and this, mixed with their unbeatable feeling they had as a result of the Six-Day War, would result in these talks amounting to nothing. Sadat knew that if Egypt's situation was ever to improve, this seemingly useless bit of desert would need to be returned. He appointed Saad el-Shazali to rebuild the under-equipped and underperforming Egyptian army, though he knew that it would be extremely difficult to defeat Israel. Then he had a cunning plan. He thought that if Egypt made any sort of gains against Israel, it would show them that they were not unbeatable and open them up to peace talks. Calling this plan a long shot would be an understatement. But options were extremely limited, and this one just might work. But why was the Sinai Peninsula so important? It was an underdeveloped piece of desert with little infrastructure. Even strategically, it was difficult to defend and traverse. To Israel, it represented security. The security that if Egypt was to attack, it would not be on Israeli soil and would not threaten Israeli citizens. It also represented their power, a sign to their hostile neighbors that they were no pushover. To Egypt, however, it was a symbol of failure. It had a substantial demoralizing effect on the Egyptian citizens. This paired with a failing economy led Sadat to believe that if he could just push the Israelis out of the Sinai, maybe it would be enough to get Egypt to back the unpopular yet important reforms he wanted to introduce to get the economy back on track. Syria would be the only other country to join Egypt in this upcoming war due to the loss of the Golan Heights in the Six-Day War. Other nations might have joined in, with Sadat pleading for more support, but sour relations paired with instability in some nations would result in only Syria and Egypt standing against Israel. However, many countries would support the war, with several sending expeditionary forces. Even so, the war would have been a lost cause if it weren't for the Soviets supplying equipment to the Egyptians and Syrians, whose militaries were still recovering after the Six-Day War. This new modern equipment would include anti-tank guided missiles, modern battle tanks equipped with infrared technology, and most importantly, surface-to-air guided missiles. This would allow Egypt to effectively deal with Israel's air force, meaning when they captured Israeli ground, its air force would not be able to effectively respond and cripple Egypt as it did in the Six-Day War. And as for why the Soviets were sticking their noses in some random Middle East conflict, they were convinced that Israel was acting on behalf of America in an attempt to capture the oil-rich fields of the region. In reality, however, Israel was acting alone, with US support, not command, and only wanted one thing: to exist. In the north, the Syrian plan was to overwhelm Israeli defensive positions with their immense force of men and tanks. As this was happening, the Egyptian army would cross the Suez to capture and secure the Israeli forts of the Bar Lev line. Then they would stop as not to advance past the range of their artillery and anti-air. Egyptian commander Shazali realized that without their air force, Israel's ability to retake the ground would be severely limited. On October 6, 1973, the invasion began and succeeded to completely surprise the Israelis. This day was significant for Israel since it was Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. This holiday was really important in the Jewish religion, and as such, a large majority of the Israeli soldiers were back home fasting. This would result in only 500 Israeli soldiers being in the Suez region at the time of invasion, facing over 80,000 Egyptian troops. Up in the north and the Golan Heights, the situation was just as bad, with 150 Israeli tanks facing a Syrian force in excess of 1,400 tanks.